We've all been transported to worlds beyond our wildest imagination with books. But books are also a great vehicle to get together and exchange ideas. Welcome to Books du Jour. Come and join our authors at the table. Welcome back to Books du Jour. Brand new episode, a brand new table. We're all starving for new books. We're in New York. There's about 100 coming out every week. So let me get started right away with our panel. Alison Richmond, The Garden of Letters. We were talking about Italy and France and all the other yummy countries. American Queen, John Oller. The subtitle is The Rise and Fall of Kate Chase Sprague, Civil War, Belle of the North, and the Gilded Age of Women of Scandals. How was that?
Yes.
Very good, yeah?
Yes.
I would like to know how you came up with such a subtitle, but I'm sure the librarians are happy about it.
A lot of back and forth.
And The Witch of Painted Sorrows, someone we've had before, a fantastic friend of mine from ITW, thriller writers, MJ Rose. So MJ, we've known each other for many years now, you and I, but I would suspect you wanted to be French. This is a confirmation. You actually want to be French.
It's not just that I want to be French, it's that I actually am French.
Oh, okay. So you don't sound like one. You don't sound like me.
No, my great-grandmother was French. Yeah. And my name is French. My real name is French. But so I actually have true French blood.
Yeah. What I love about your book is it's always a great lesson in history. The research, how does that go for you?
Even though I know a lot about it,
Yeah.
I still have to research each book anew and have to go back to Paris for each book, which is really a crime to have to go back so often.
Difficult.
Very difficult, very difficult. But this book was a new period that I really didn't, I knew a lot about the art of this period, but I didn't know as much about the courtesans. And, you know, every book is a different time period, so the streets change, the buildings change, the restaurants change, and I have to do all that research. This is the first book that's totally set in the past, and there's no present at all, and that was a departure for me. And that made it more difficult because I couldn't, when I got stuck not knowing where something was in a street, I couldn't cut to the present. I had to like find it. So it was a little bit different.
The story is a young woman who decides to go to Paris, of all places.
Yeah, it's a New York woman who runs away from her husband, who's a little bit brutal, and she runs to her grandmother in Paris, who lives in a fabulous mansion that has a name called Maison de la Lune. And there's a legend attached to the house that once upon a time in the 16th century, a courtesan lived there who eventually became a witch. And
is that a true story, or is it?
No, it's all made up.
Made up.
There are a lot of people in the book who were real, but
Yeah.
the story's made up. And she gets to Paris, and her grandmother tries very hard to keep her away from the house, and she doesn't know why. And it turns out because the witch, who lives in the house, the spirit of the witch, always looks for a young relative, a daughter of La Lune is what we call her, to possess and take over. Because the witch has been trying for over almost 300 years to find somebody who she can inhabit so she can feel love again. And so Sandrine kind of becomes her victim.
The vehicle.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the wonderful thing about it is it's not all dark. The witch allows Sandrine to realize her artistic talent. Women were not allowed at the Beaux-Arts in 1894, which is when the book takes place. There wasn't actually, in real life, there wasn't a woman who was allowed in until 1896. I have Sandrine getting in 1894, and it's a scandal.
It's very interesting in your books. Darkness and the occult and sexuality is always intertwined. Do you feel like there's a moral when you feel like the moral stands in the way of sexuality or freedom?
You know, somebody once said that every writer only has one book in them, and they just keep writing the same book over and over and over again. So I kind of think in another life I must have been a very happy nun who had no sex, who just totally believed in God, and was so repressed that in this life I have to keep exploring the same dark, sexy, occult world.
So we won't ask you if your life is like that, but at least in novel it seems to be. John, talking about Kate Chase Sprague, which is a mouthful to say, we won't talk about sexuality, but she had quite a hell of a life. Rag to riches, back to rags, pretty much.
Yes, she was born Kate Chase. She married William Sprague.
Right, that's right.
Kate Chase was the daughter of Salmon P. Chase, who was the Treasury Secretary for Abraham Lincoln.
So she didn't start as a rag. She started in the riches.
Yes.
She got really rich,
She
really rich.
She had a rise and fall, as the subtitle
That's right, yes.
says. She married one of the richest men in the world. He also was a little bit brutal. She married him in the social event of the Civil War. I would say she was sort of a People magazine person 100 years before People magazine was first published. She was a socialite, the belle of the ball. Men loved her, admired her. Women, she had a somewhat more problematic relationship with. Many were jealous of her.
Because of the power,
Because of her
the
power,
beauty.
her beauty, her magnetism, and she did things that women didn't normally do in her day, such as run her father's campaigns for president,
That's very exciting.
scheme behind the scenes in parlors and convention halls.
So you went to like smoking pot or something more exotic like that.
And then she had a scandalous affair because her husband had so many serial infidelities. Kate was entitled to at least one of her own. And so she took up with Roscoe Conkling, who was not well known today, but in his day he was a very powerful senator, probably the most powerful senator in the U.S. Congress. He was married, she was married, and they were caught, not quite in flagrante, but almost at her mansion in Oceanside, Narragansett, Rhode Island. And her husband came home in the middle of the night and found Conkling there the next morning at breakfast with Kate and chased him away with a shotgun into town. It was all over the papers, and she was scandalized by that and ostracized because in those days a man could withstand a sexual scandal, but a woman really couldn't so easily. There were fewer second acts in America back then.
How did you find her, and what was the interest of writing her memoir?
Well, I'd always been interested in the Civil War, and as a kid I had read this book, sort of a young adult book, vignettes of Civil War personalities, many of them sort of on the periphery, not the main characters, and she was one in it. And somehow that always stuck with me. About a dozen years ago, I actually wrote a screenplay, semi-fictional, historical, about her. It didn't work as well as a screenplay, and then when I came to need a new project for writing, I turned back to her and wrote a nonfiction biography.
Yeah. The research must have been very intense, how to find piecemeal these disparate elements. How did you manage to construct everything?
Yes, I traveled quite a bit to Rhode Island, Ohio, Washington, D.C., and Paris, where she lived when she was older. Found a census record there where she had was found in a small town as the only American living in near Fontainebleau. Interestingly, she lied about her age by 10 years, so some things don't change.
That's right.
But I had a lot of help from her family descendants who
Okay.
gave me little mementos and letters and trinkets that had never been seen by the public before. And many of those were very revealing.
So when you get involved with someone who is obviously passed away, you had a conception of them when you start, and as you investigate the past and the life, did you find your relationship changing?
I worked with one of the family members who was constantly telling me to go deeper. I hope I succeeded, but eventually I think I just came to a fuller understanding of her. I don't know that it was necessarily more positive or negative than when I started, but it was richer, I would say.
Well, we're talking about a love affair, which is actually your love affairs to Kate's love affair. Your book seems to have a lot of romance in it as well, and
There is romance in the
Yes,
book.
okay.
I think this was my first novel where I wrote from the perspective of a musician, but I wanted to sort of create a novel in which I showed how a musician in World War II could have used their talent as a form of resistance. Mm-hmm. There are different characters that come into the novel, which I don't want to give too much away, but something happens.
You're
to
moving
him.
too fast, but maybe you could tell our audience what the story is about.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Always help, yeah?
The Garden of Letters is about a cellist in the Italian resistance who sends coded messages through her music, and the novel weaves into it the different people during the war who helped save her and bring about a change in her from this very young, innocent girl who is a music student right when the war is beginning in Italy to a woman who ends up in a small village in Italy and who is saved by someone several years her senior but brings with him his own journey. And so it becomes sort of a layering of different stories and a journey of a musician at that time who undertakes great risk in order to oppose something that she thinks is unjust.
So all your books are located in the past. Yeah. Why not the present? Is that the past is safer and we can live by proxy, like feel courageous in the past when we're not in the present? Or what does that represent to you?
When I'm creating a world in my novels, I want to create something in which I see and I feel deeply, and which I have control over, yes, because it's in the past. And it's just something that I think becomes a sort of an inversion of my truest self.
Sure. So why the art? Is that the only place to express freedom?
I attribute so much of the way I write from my mother. My mother taught me to see the world through an artistic lens, that everything, every landscape has its own color and texture, that every story we tell has its own light and shadow. I think that's why I love MJ's work so much.
Your writing is very concrete, it's not abstract at all.
It's not abstract, but it's very visual. And I think when I create a chapter, I feel as though I'm first imagining it from, almost like a painting where you're stepping into the canvas and you can, the sentences have become like brush strokes that move you through the story. When I started interviewing musicians and composers, what I learned was that they hear music the way an artist sees color or texture. So every note has light and shadow. A musical score has positive and negative space.
There's an emotion.
Yes, and so that was very liberating when I heard their vocabulary was the same of how they heard things. It was the way I saw things. And so there became a melding in that story when I created the character of Elodie. And she sends messages for the resistance. When she plays her cello, there is a space in the music called the cadenza where she can use sort of her creativity to express something, and it's woven into that part of her score.
Feels like almost to touch your strength or inner self or an identity where you feel like it's you. You almost have to live these incredible experience. Otherwise, if you stay home, if nothing happens,
Right.
It's very much a story of growing up. Would you agree with that, your characters often?
I would, and
Yes.
I feel that's why it's so essential to go to the countries that you're researching and meet with people who might have been alive during that time period. So in the same way that MJ goes to Paris, I went to Italy and I interviewed partisans who were in the mountains, or female messengers who sent coded messages through different techniques. And when I heard their stories or how they expressed themselves, I could sort of put myself into their, into their footsteps and see what their, create a journey that had a sense of veracity, so that it wasn't just historically accurate, it was emotionally authentic as well when you heard about how they experienced life at that time.
Yeah. So MJ, the art is a very big part of your books as well. To access the sensuousness of the being, it's a major theme as well in your book.
I went to art school to become a painter.
Yeah. Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was an art major. I wrote for myself, but I really wanted to be an artist. And then at a certain point, I realized I was very bad. So I think that I sort of paint books. It's very similar to how Allison does it, but I think I'm more aware of the plot. But when I'm actually writing, I'm seeing the book in my head, and I'm writing down what I see, like it's a movie running in my head.
The art is often a way to, I say, like to enter a new side of yourself you have not. I mean, this woman becomes a painter, gets into the Beaux-Arts, and then she finds a sexuality,
Yeah,
or
she
freedom.
discovers her sexuality.
So that's always prominent.
Especially in the past, art for women was very much a way to explore things that they couldn't explore in reality. I mean, they couldn't be free and open the way they could as an artist. It was like shocking.
And I think what's also interesting in building upon that is this sense of sort of creating behind the veil. So you have the artist who can say, well, I'm an artist and that's why I'm experimenting and I'm doing this. You see it with sort of a diffused lens, and it's not as shocking because they're an artist. So as a writer, you can explore things behind that, which normally the average person might have, said, well, that's too scandalous. How could that have happened? But because she's an artist, it very well could have happened.
Right, like your character probably lost out because she couldn't be an artist, right?
Well,
I mean, she was in a political world.
Her sister was an artist, whereas Kate was the more political.
But that was very creative in herself. No?
Yes, it was
a major gift
her
she
life
had.
was more creative.
So her father was pretty stiff, from what you write.
Yes. Cold fish. His name was Salmon.
That's right. Yeah. Salmon. But The impact on her must have been really strong for her to become such a easy swimming fish, right, in the political
Yes.
world.
He was very critical of her when she was a 9-year-old girl. She went off to boarding school in New York. He would write her these letters saying, "Oh, your penmanship is terrible, your letters are terrible, you know, why can't you be better? I want perfection." And she sort of bought into that. She became a perfectionist herself. He was a widower, had been married 3 times, lost all 3 wives, so she was in effect his social hostess.
So what was her involvement in the art? Was what, just what we call today? She was just
She
a
collected
benefactor?
things. She had a huge mansion in Rhode Island she had to stock with Auger's d'art and paintings.
Oller, that's for glass, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I remember that.
And she was always making trips to Europe and buying up the place. And she was a bit of a spendthrift, and but they had the money at that time, and then it disappeared in an economic crash. And then they had their affairs, and the whole thing just blew up.
How do you come up with your story, MJ? Because it's very creative on your plots and the quality of your story. Where they come from?
I have no idea.
No,
I have
but
no
is it you have
idea.
spirit talking at you during your sleep?
While I'm sleeping.
Or really, yeah. When you're sleeping.
No, I get a single thought. It's not even necessarily a whole idea. With this book, it was the idea that there was a witch in Paris. And then I do this thing that I call procrastinate your way into writing a novel. I start a journal for my main character, and I start creating the character in the journal. It's a lot of collages, and I find fabric and pictures and postcards and old letters, and I start researching, and I write all the research in the
So it's very
journal.
visual, right?
Yeah, and after about 3 months of torturing myself on paper, the idea starts to come. And then I torture a couple of friends. I recently tortured Allison on my next book, where I have to talk out the story a lot.
You don't
I
have no husband involved in the torturing?
No.
So who helps you write your book?
Well, I yesterday called MJ because I was having a crisis, and I said something has to happen, and I just speaking out loud when you're at sort of a plot point, you know, in a crossroads is very helpful, and you have to have someone who understands, I guess, your vision. And I get very wrapped up in the description and getting into all the historical details, but there's certain great plot devices that I always feel that I struggle with creating narrative tension and things like that. So it was wonderful to be able to speak with MJ about when I knew that I had to have a climax within the book, plot-wise, not sexually, that I called MJ. I probably should call her about that one too.
No, that's what the husband's for.
But,
That's right.
for me, I guess all of my novels do begin with a question that I don't know the answer to.
Beautiful.
I was at a dinner party when someone shared with me a story about how their father was fleeing from Hungary during World War II as the Nazis were coming in to occupy the country, and he was given forged papers and told to try and escape through Italy to get to Morocco. He gets to this port and he's sure he's going to be discovered, and all of a sudden, out of the crowd, this big barrel-chested Italian man cries, "Cousin, cousin, I've been waiting for you all week," waves to the German guards and is able to get him out of the, harm's way and back to his small home in the cliffs of Portofino. And that evening, my friend's father said, "Why did you save me? You realize I'm not your cousin." And the man said to him, "I try and come to the port every few months. I try and save the person who looks the most afraid." Right at that point when I heard that story, I had sort of this, you can imagine lightning coming out of my ears, but I thought how fascinating to begin a novel where 2 people's lives intersect at a port. One person who is in desperate need of shelter, the other person who sees this person's fear and recognizes it. And so I wanted to begin from that point and then build upon that about how do we communicate without the use of words. The Garden of Letters really becomes 2 parallel stories right from the first chapter, opening that way of who is this person who is in desperate need of shelter, and why does this person want to give that person shelter, and how do they recognize each other's flyers of one needing the other person without communicating with words.
I have a question for both of you. When you write, do you consciously write for a female audience or more neutral, or do you even think about that?
I certainly would never say I write for the female audience or the male. I write for myself what I'm intellectually curious about. And so whether it's a male or a female, as long as you're interested in what I'm telling, then you're my reader. But what's happening, I think, in publishing is that how they market you with their cover, how, where they promote you is geared more to women. So I inevitably will become more well read by women, but it's not because I actively seek that.
I would disagree with you.
Really?
Yeah, because I feel that you have a strong woman's voice, yeah? And you talk about topics that a man will not talk about, or you talk about the emotions and the relationship, and a man will not talk about that way.
Well,
I think at the end of the day, you're very empowering to women because you show them the way, you can find strength and you can find life.
But I don't consciously write for women.
No.
I actually, through my website, hear more often from men who say, I was given your book by my wife, I didn't think I was going to like it, and I have to write because I found it so interesting.
But the wife.
The wife
gave
gave
it.
always the wife. Yes,
That's the reality of publishing. I mean,
What?
all fiction is 65% women, bought by women. Women will buy books written by men or women, but men do not buy books written by women unless it's like forced on them, or it's
Harry
an
Potter.
anomaly. Over 80% of the books that men buy are written by men.
And also, I think
John,
men
what do you buy?
nonfiction.
All prior biographers of Kate Chase had been women, and my publisher believes that, and my agent believes that 80% of the readership for my book would be women. So.
Who are your readers?
Well, I think it's pretty much
90%?
statistically what it is. I mean, I think that we're all in that. There's no way around it. I write a combination of, there's a little suspense, and there's a little of this woo-woo, she's a witch, there's been reincarnation. They're called upmarket, which I don't know what that means. It means it doesn't appeal to a lot of people. And then there's, on top of everything, there's the erotic nature of all the books. Nobody knows where to put them. So between are you writing for women, and what genre are you writing in? I'm like, there are good books and there are bad books, and hopefully this is a good book.
You're very visual. Your writing is extremely visual. Have you got any film adaptations, offers?
My fourth novel is being adapted into film. It's in development now. That's the
What's the
novel,
title?
The Lost Wife.
The Lost Wife.
So currently the
It's a
screenwriter
film for men.
working on the screenplay, and hopefully it'll move into production. That's
Did you
all
write
I
the
can hope for.
screenplay?
I did not. I never wanted to. I think I would be terrible at it. But
It's a skill, right?
I'm very hopeful that it will be a great screenplay.
So what's next for you apart from the film adaptation?
I'm working now on a novel that takes place in Belle Époque, Paris, and also it's a dual storyline with also World War II Paris, but it's about an apartment that was discovered in 2010 that had belonged to a courtesan by the name of Martha de Florian. And when the apartment was opened up in 2010, it had been kept locked for 70 years. So when the heirs to this apartment opened it up, they found a painting by the 19th century portrait painter Giovanni Boldini of the courtesan Martha de Florian, and all of her belongings, as if she had just locked the door herself and had left. But indeed, it was her granddaughter who had locked the door just as the Germans were coming into Paris. So I had, started my friendship with MJ had begun when she was researching the Witch of Painted Sorrows, which is also in the Belle Époque with a courtesan. And so it's, there's some overlap there because I, was researching much of what she researched in her novel.
John, what's for you? Another 10 years before you come up with something?
No, I'm actually well into another biography. This one of a man, my first biography of a man.
What's wrong with it?
A Revolutionary War hero, Francis Marion, better known as the Swamp Fox. There have been prior biographies of him, but not in 40 years.
I'm curious, when did you decide to become a writer, a long-form writer, as opposed to just short pieces journalism?
My first book was on Jean Arthur, the film actress of the 30s and 40s, and that was just the right vehicle for that. Was a full-length biography, and since then that's been my preferred mode. Although I did do a true crime book in the last year, which led to the reopening of a 40-year-old homicide cold case in Ohio, which had taken place when I was in college there. So that was done as a sort of a shorter e-book. So I'm not yet at the point. Someday I'll try fiction, maybe, but it's not my forte, and my hat's off to fiction writers.
Well, you landed with a great publisher. And MJ, you already something You have a
the
contract
24 years after this book ends.
Okay.
It's about this character's daughter.
Okay, so the progression.
19.
So that's pretty late for you for France
Yeah,
that year, yeah? So we're like in World War
1918.
One?
Yeah, 1918,
Yeah, that's right,
World War
okay.
One. The research has been unbelievable. I was just in Paris in November.
And it's easier to find too because it's not so far back.
Yeah, it's easier to find. They have telephones. It's so confusing.
What's that?
It's like they can actually get in touch with each other. That's what I love about historical fiction is the drama of not being able to get in touch with each other, and suddenly they have phones. But it's actually 1918. They don't have a lot of phones. So.
And I think it's a great place to wrap this episode of Books du Jour. Alison Richmond, The Gauntlet of Letters. Book came out a few months ago, but it's doing well. We have The American Queen. I'm not going to say the subtitle, but it's John Oller, a great publisher. I love them. It's the life of Kate Chase Sprague. And The Witch of Painted Sorrows by M.J. Rose, which will be out in March. And by the time you watch this episode, it'll be everywhere for sale. Thank you for being on Books du Jour, and all the best for you.
Thank you.